Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, which is Advice to the Sector on Next Steps in Self-Assurance. My name is Emma Marks and I am the Manager of Education and Guidance in ASQA, and today I am joined by Christina Bolger, who is the Executive General Manager of Quality and Risk, and also Michele, who is our Director of the Reform Taskforce. Now, today is the last ASQA webinar for 2020. So I would like to thank you for taking the time today to tune in. Coming from an RTO, I recognise that this week in particular is the notoriously most crazy week that you can possibly experience, as everybody tries to get everything finalised before holidays. So thank you very much for dialing in. If you have people in your teams who have been unable to, just remember we are pre-recording this, so they'll be able to watch it in the coming weeks when they've got a bit more time. So with that in mind, let's get straight into it. I'll go through the basics of how our webinars work. In terms of audio, you would have joined the session using your computer's speaker system by default. If you would prefer to use your phone to listen to the webinar, select telephone in the audio panel of your control panel and the dial-in information will be displayed. For this webinar, all participants have their audio muted, so you should only hear the three of us talking. Today's session will run for about 60 minutes. We're aiming to present for probably half of that so that we will have time for questions at the end. Now, you can submit questions by typing them into the questions pane of your control panel. And I have already received one question about the opportunity to see other people's questions and chat, so it's a bit more interactive. I would really love to do that. Unfortunately, the software we use doesn't allow us to have that capability. So it's something that we'll take on board for next year to see what we can do, particularly if we're running smaller groups, having a bit more of interactive availability. So from experience, we do get quite a lot of questions. We hope to group them in themes, noting that I'll be busily creating them live. And then if we can't get to all questions, we do still consider those questions that we pose. Let's see how we can update them in terms of FAQs for future webinars, and particularly that self-assurance is such a big topic. There'll definitely be a lot more things on our webpage going forward. Now, please keep the questions broad and relevant to the entire audience, relevant to today's topic as well, being self-assurance. We are unable to answer questions that are specific to your individual circumstance. And finally, as a reminder, the presentation is being recorded. So we'll go to the next slide. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. So next slide. So in August, you will recall that we did conduct a webinar which began to identify our focus on effective self-assurance. If you would like to review that webinar again, it is available on our website under resources, and then you go to our YouTube page. Now, today's session will follow on from that topic. So in the last half of this year, we have been working with the sector to understand how to strengthen self-assurance capability and practice for both providers and for ASQA. Our end goal is to create a shared understanding of how providers can use systems and processes to critically examine their performance and outcomes. And in turn, this will enable providers to manage their risks to their ongoing compliance and identify ways to continuously improve to achieve sustained compliance. In today's Ask ASQA webinar, Christina and Michele will share insights from our consultation with the sector. ASQA recently shared a summary report of the feedback from this process, and they'll discuss how this, together with other sector consultation outcomes, informs our evolution to our risk-based regulatory approach and how it directs our focus more towards effective provider self-assurance. So as I've said, we will have time for questions. I have already started to receive some through, so you are welcome to submit questions at any time through the presentation and we will collate them from the end. So firstly, I will hand over to Christina. Thank you very much, Christina.
Thanks very much, Emma, and hello again, everyone, as we creep closer to Christmas. I'm very happy to be here to talk about self-assurance because I think this is one of the fundamental shifts that both regulator and the regulated sector need to make in terms of improving outcomes and focusing on excellence in the vet sector. And I think if we reflect back to some of the findings of the rapid review, it was quite evident that a recurring theme was a focus on inputs and compliance controls as opposed to self-assurance by providers and the type of governance and systems that need to work around the clock to ensure and provide quality outcomes. And in particular, the work that we're doing with you in this area is delivering on a couple of rapid review recommendations, and those are on your screen now, and they are promoting and facilitating a culture of effective self-assurance as an integral part of the routine operations of a provider, and also driving cooperative relationships, which is, underpinning the work that we're currently doing with you and other stakeholders. And I think really making this shift around systemic assurance and continuous improvement, and understanding the role that standards play in that, that the standards aren't there to satisfy the regulator, they're there to support you to achieve quality and to assure yourselves that you're meeting the requirements. And so this is underpinned really by good business practice, isn't it? I mean, if we're not getting this right, if you haven't got this as part of your business operations, then there are opportunities being missed for improvement and opportunities being missed to tackle risks early on before they are detected by the regulator. So it's fundamental, and I think there's probably really 3 good reasons why this is important for providers. I think you'd agree and embrace the concept that this is the right thing to do in terms of improving outcomes for students and lifting confidence in the vet sector. It's the smart thing to do because businesses and providers that do this well set themselves apart and actually are achieving market advantage and ensuring themselves that they're getting the very best outcomes for their students. And thirdly, it's the law. So, we've already got requirements under the standards that focus on these activities and the requirements of providers to continuously improve. So 3 fundamental reasons why this is important. So I'll move to the next slide. This intent, I guess, to shift towards self-assurance is also underpinned by another key change that we're seeking to make, which is to strengthen our engagement and education. Because obviously, if we are doing a good job at promoting sector-wide learning, if we are doing a good job at sharing our own understanding of risk as we see it in the sector, then we're better equipping providers to apply those learnings and to understand the risks as we see them and identify ways in which they can be addressed through their own assurance actions. And all of our efforts in implementing these reforms are underpinned by these 3 values that you can see on your screen. And you'll be hearing a lot more about these 3 things in all aspects of ASQA's work. And they are consistency, underpinning the way in which we approach our evidence collection, our decision making, our audit methodology, collaboration through events such as this and the workshops that we are running around the compliance framework, because we know we are only one part of the quality system and we need to work with others to ensure that we're optimising quality outcomes. Stronger relationships will lead to more effective outcomes, and we will actively be seeking opportunities to work with you on that. And thirdly, and very much at the centre of this move to greater self-assurance, is continuous improvement. And, this applies to ASQA as much as to the sector, really having the honesty and the courage to reflect and evaluate and to explore new approaches and to adapt those approaches to ensure that we get the very best outcomes. So that's really all I wanted to say in introducing this session. I'm looking forward to it and hope that we have plenty of opportunity to engage with you around the questions that you may have. I'll hand over to Michele.
Thanks, Christina, and good afternoon, everyone. So just in talking about self-assurance and what the sector has told us and how that will be informing our next steps in regulation, I'd just like to take us back to the original consultation paper and just to situate our thinking in our discussion here today, the definition of self-assurance as we outlined in the original consultation paper. And it was really about providers having systems and processes in place to ensure that you are critically examining your performance, so performance being your compliance with requirements, and the outcomes you deliver to your students on an ongoing basis to identify ways that you can continuously improve. So it's about having systems and processes in place to say, well, how can I give myself confidence and assurance that I will be meeting the standards now today and in the future? Do I have effective controls in place that will allow me to know when those systems are not working properly? And when I do, how do I go about continuously improving to make sure I meet those standards? The original webinar and the consultation paper also identified that self-assurance is part of the standards as they exist already. So it sits under standard 2, which talks about, the operations of a provider or an RTO being quality assured. So it talks about making sure under 2.1 that you are consistently meeting requirements on an ongoing basis. And under 2.2, making sure that you're really making sure that you meet those standards under 2.2, which is about standard 1, your training and assessment practice. Because really, training and assessment practice is the thing that leads to the qualification a student has. And if you have valid training and assessment practice, then industry and students can be confident that the outcomes that you're delivering are fit for purpose and meet industry's needs. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So in living those values that Christina talked about collaboration, continuous improvement, and obviously consistency as well, we have been engaging with the sector, and you may have read some of the summary outcomes from the consultation paper back in August. But essentially, we undertook some additional consultation activities since that consultation paper. You had the opportunity to make your submission. And we undertook an additional workshop with a subcommittee of our stakeholder liaison group. And that was really focusing on the key features of what a self-assurance system might look like for the sector. And we also asked similar questions of sector peak bodies so that we can understand from a user-centered design perspective and the impacts on industry, things that we were thinking about in the self-assurance space, but the sector's view on what they thought was important in implementing an increased focus on self-assurance. So some of the sector peak bodies that we consulted included Adult Learning Australia, the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the Australian Industry Group, Community Colleges Australia, English Australia, ERTOA, which is the Enterprise RTO Association, IHEA, the Independent Higher Education Australia, ITECA, Independent Tertiary Education Council Australia, NIAS, and English Australia, which both I've mentioned before, represent the English language sector, and TAFE Directors Australia. So quite a diverse group of stakeholders that we consulted. So what we heard, I'll talk very quickly about the consultation paper first, because as I said, some of you may have read that. But essentially we asked 3 key questions. The first question was around what action should we be taking to increase our focus on self-assurance and to support the sector in that shift. And it talked about short, medium and long term. Initially, in the short term, providers suggested or stakeholders suggested more information on self-assurance as a concept to help their understanding to build capability, but also examples, guidance and tools to help understanding and capability in self-assurance. Longer term though, providers were seeking for ASQA to recognise good practice. So it's not just about what you're not compliant in, it's about what you're compliant in, and helping share some of those examples with the sector to improve, and to differentiate our treatments based on the extent to which a provider self-assures. And you may have read the compliance policy. You can start to see some of that emerging already in that document and our shift towards a greater focus on self-assurance. They also want us to consider performance under other regulatory regimes as part of our monitoring. So that might be funding bodies, industry regimes, where we have data sharing opportunities, where can we leverage off that to understand what your performance is like in other regulated areas, which might help us understand the likelihood of compliance and good performance in our sector as well. And certainly something that's come out quite strongly in our consultation across the various avenues is stronger governance and accountability requirements for provider management. So governance is coming out as a really strong thing in our consultation. The second question, if we can go to the next slide, please. The second question asked what mechanisms for self-assurance providers are already using. So one comment, so I'll talk about Claire Field helping us with some work, and her observations as well as our observations were, and it perhaps was a little bit influenced by the fact that we limited the number of words you could put into a response, but a lot of our responses weren't systemic in terms of describing self-assurance. So it might be doing a couple of things that help you self-assure, but it generally wasn't talking about self-assurance as a system-wide or whole of organisation approach. So that's ultimately where we need to get to as a sector to make sure it is more systemic than we're currently seeing. But the most common response in relation to how providers are self-assuring related to internal audits and self-assessments. So a lot of providers are doing those and using continuous improvement registers and plans to help them help assure themselves that they are meeting the requirements and delivering student outcomes on an ongoing basis. Governance boards or education committees, particularly for larger providers, were often nominated as ways they go about them, which is a good thing, but obviously not suitable for all providers. And often those governance board or education committees were looking at or reviewing multiple requirements at the same time. So whether it's enterprise requirements, industry requirements, RTO standards, funding requirements, having a look across the system to see how the organisation was ensuring that it meets all of those requirements to deliver outcomes for students and industry. There was also quite a lot of providers talked about having dedicated compliance staff, working committees that had the responsibility for monitoring, reviewing and maintaining compliance for the provider. And there were variations of the number of ways providers go about making sure that learners and industry needs are met. So some examples included where they'd engage with industry from the start of the design of the program through to the implementation, to the review and continuous improvement. So engaging industry at all steps, obtaining student feedback was quite common, using quality indicator data, using student performance data. So various ways in which they're making sure that those needs were met. And that's obviously pretty critical as an outcome because it's about making sure that students have the outcomes industry needs. So you can see the connection there with learners and industry. Networking to share information and resources and to develop staff and continuously improve compliance requirements. And I think I heard that our online webinar earlier this week, there was even some of that happening through the questions and providers sharing examples. So I can see some evidence of networking having a strong feature in our future in terms of how providers might go about self-assuring. And that networking, you may have watched my previous webinar, it talked about the Scottish system, which is about looking inwards, outwards and forwards. And I think networking has a really strong place in terms of looking outwards and helping you to compare your performance with other providers to benchmark your performance. And then finally, there was the ongoing professional development for staff, and that included to maintain currency. So that was the general feedback about mechanisms currently being used. So quite a diverse range of them. So it was good to see that. So next slide, please. And then the final question we asked was about improving the annual declaration of compliance. And I'll talk about our next steps in that soon. But essentially, there was two trains of thoughts in this area. And one was about requiring providers to account that they have actually reviewed their operations and are self-assuring. And to identify how they actually go about improving deficiencies. So that was quite a strong thing that came out, a little bit linked to governance, as I talked about earlier. But also the other thing was, and it was probably more of an interim measure, collecting and sharing examples of good practice so that we could build capability across the sector in self-assurance. Other feedback we received were about there's too many questions, so we need to refine the number of questions. People suggested we could focus on something a little bit more focused, for example, the student journey or indicators of self-assurance. And we did have quite a lot of feedback around the functionality of the form, which we will be having a look at. If nothing else, we can improve the amount of effort and how it's actually submitted. So beyond the consultation paper, so I can move to the next slide, please. Beyond the consultation paper, we worked with the stakeholder liaison group subcommittee, as I said, and as well as with the industry and provider groups. And we asked them about key features that a self-assurance model should include for the sector, trying to gain some insights around how decisions we make might impact the sector and what might make the shift a little bit easier for providers so understanding how they currently go about it, but what could be some key features. And Claire Field conducted the consultation with us, which was a really good thing, because she's well respected in the sector, and she's pretty frank and fearless in the way she consults. So it was a good thing to work with Claire in this space. The first thing that came out of our consultation was that providers currently like the student experience. So they like these stages of marketing, enrolment, student progression, training and assessment completion, but also that extra stage of regulatory compliance and governance. So using that model in order to say, well, when I review my operations and focusing on marketing and recruitment, how effective am I in ensuring that most students can make informed decisions with the information that I provide? In enrolment, am I ensuring that my students are properly matched to the course that they're about to undertake, and are their needs understood? So just thinking about those different stages of the student journey seemed to be an effective way of self-assuring. It also became quite obvious that industry and employer feedback is important. So that's that making sure that industry's needs are met and that the students are job ready were the words that stakeholders used. And using data, feedback and other evidence is necessary to properly understand performance. And a little bit of this, in my original webinar, I talked about having confidence in your ability to, confidence that you are meeting the standards. A little bit of feedback I've had is that it goes beyond providers being confident in themselves. It goes to evidence-based reflection. So when you're reflecting, what evidence suggests that you're doing a good job, more than just how you feel about it? Is it triangulating your information? Is it about using information from a variety of sources to say, actually, it suggests we are doing a good job, or hang on, there might be a problem here, and let's work with our stakeholders to try and resolve that. So evidence-based reflection was seen to be important by stakeholders. And again, governance, as I said, it came out as a key theme, making sure you have the right people, systems and processes, including your controls, to ensure that you are effectively monitoring, reviewing and continuously improving. So as I said, governance was a key theme. Next slide, please. So the next question we asked the stakeholder liaison group and our peaks was around what challenges could we face in implementing or shifting to a greater focus on self-assurance. One of the first ones obviously was, yet again, governance, no surprise there. So engaging more or somehow finding a way to engage CEOs, boards and management generally so that it becomes a whole of organisation cultural change. The fear was that if it was seen not engaging enough with these bodies meant that it would become a tick and flick exercise and just another compliance activity for the compliance staff in the organisation to manage, when in fact it is a whole of organisation cultural piece. We're also, their views were that smaller providers are often likely to be less mature and unlikely to have the formal systems for continuous improvement. So there was a sense that we needed to be providing a little more support, the sector needed to provide more support for smaller providers. We talked to the business group specifically about gaining feedback from employers because it was a contentious issue in a lot of the discussions we had. And the business groups themselves say that it can be difficult to actually get feedback from employers. So one of our challenges will be, and for providers as well, seeking feedback from employers and being able to obtain that feedback in order to continuously improve your operations. So that was considered to be a challenge. And finally, choosing a quality consultant, and this came from the consultants themselves. We had a few of those in the groups that we consulted, that there's probably a need for greater guidance for providers who, particularly small providers, who might outsource things like a self-assessment or an audit, annual audit. So there was feedback that we need to be able to provide advice, some guidance around how to pick or how to choose or work with a quality consultant. People use the term cookie cutter approach, where a consultant will try to bring in the same approach regardless of the provider's size and demographic, all those things. So it is about making sure that you have a consultant who understands your needs and doesn't apply the same approach regardless of who you are. Next slide, please. And then finally, we asked them about how we could best support providers to strengthen self-assurance culture in their approach. It was pointed out that ASQA actually has a lot of good tools, and it was a little bit surprising to hear that people actually like the self-assessment tool in its current state. They found the user's guide very useful, and that there's a number of other fact sheets, so choosing a good training or education provider that already exist. And the advice was that we've got some good resources. We probably just need to shape them up in a way that makes them more accessible for providers, perhaps aligning with the student journey, but making better use of the resources we currently have. Providers also talk about a calendar of reminders and probably align a little bit to the annual declaration for the future, not immediately, in that it might be a reminder around, this month, have a look at particular standards or particular parts of the student journey in terms of self-assuring. So just a reminder. Guidance notes. So people like the guidance notes that are out there. Aged Care and TEXA have some guidance notes which talk about when you're self-assuring, consider these things, ask these questions. So that's other feedback we received. And then other possible benchmarking tools. So access to data is not necessarily something that's available to providers at the moment, but it was suggested that things like webinars that we've been conducting and other ones that you might suggest might help you to reflect on your current practice in terms of your performance and identify ways in which you can improve. Releasing survey results, including our student survey results, and so that you can compare how your students are tracking compared to others. And networking and peer collaboration obviously is a good opportunity that I've talked about. And obviously the advice on choosing a good consultant, as I've talked about earlier, and possible training opportunities that might be out there for providers. So next slide, please. This is, I included this slide because it was a direct statement we made in our original webinar, and it was about self-assurance is not self-regulation. And it's a little bit of a theme of something that we continue to hear in our consultation. A fear that ASQA was going soft on providers who are not doing the right thing. That if you are self-assured, you're endorsed, and that ASQA leaves you alone forever. All those kinds of things are still coming through in our consultation. So I just want to clarify that self-assurance or self-assured is not a status or an endorsement. A performance assessment will assess the level to which you are meeting your compliance requirements and delivering outcomes for students, and in the fullness of time, it's the strongest self-assurance approach. But it's really, self-assurance is really about providers taking and sharing that responsibility for quality by looking after their risks and managing their risks. So it's the shift from ASQA having to be across every risk in the sector and being seen as responsible for managing risks, like detecting providers, managing performance. So it's an extension of our risk-based approach by providers taking part of that responsibility in terms of managing their own risk. Your self-assurance and your ability to self-assure is considered in our regulatory approach. It doesn't mean that we stop monitoring you. So we still monitor the whole sector in terms of, having a look at if we're managing a particular risk and we want to select some providers to review their performance. A provider who has good performance, that would be considered in terms of who we select versus a provider who's demonstrated an inability to self-assure in the past. It's also considered in our decision-making. So if you are found to be non-compliant through an assessment that we undertake, it's obviously a factor that's considered in terms of your commitment and capability to quality outcomes. So if you've have demonstrated self-assurance in the past, it's obviously a factor that we consider when making a decision around the type of response that we might take in the decision that we make. So it does have a place, but it just doesn't mean that once you're deemed to be self-assured, ASQA's not looking anymore as part of our monitoring systems. So hopefully that clarifies it for people and relays some of those fears that we're allowing providers who are not doing the right thing to self-regulate. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's the bit you've probably been waiting for. So we've outlined the consultation we've undertaken and how that feeds into our next steps, and it definitely has informed our next steps. So in 2021, early next year, we'll be focusing a little bit on providing some more information around the assessment methodology. There will be some shifts in April in terms of how we go about undertaking performance assessments, and you can hear me using the word assessment versus audit. So we'll start to shift to different language, and there will be some more information coming out about this, but I don't want to focus on it at this point because that information is still being shaped up, as is some of our internal processes. So there'll be information about that. But part of the shift will be, and this was talked about in the audit methodology webinar that Carmen did earlier in the year, it is about focusing more on standards that align more closely with outcomes, and self-assurance is an outcome. So it's sampling slightly different standards, but there's some of the changes we'll make. And we also talk about a shift from compliance inputs towards more outcomes. Now, a lot of people ask, what does that mean? So as an example, you might look at the standard that relates to marketing, and you still need to comply with the standards. You still need to make sure that your marketing is accurate. But the shift in the outcome, and if you read the context statement for a standard, it actually talks about the outcome the standard's intending to achieve, and it's actually about students being able to make informed choices about their training and assessment needs and about the study they want to undertake. So it's not only is it accurate, does it meet all that, but are students actually able to make an informed choice? So they're the types of outcomes that we'll be looking at as part of the audit approach. We will be revising the self-assessment tool, and that's the next step, or refreshing the self-assessment tool. Revise is a little bit heavy because we don't want to make major change. We don't want to throw providers into chaos by making too many shifts too quickly. And refresh, what I mean is we might want to make sure that it is actually helping you to understand some of these subtle changes that we'll be making in the assessment methodology. Providers tell us that the self-assessment tool currently does lend itself to self-assurance because it has the reflective questions in there. It does talk a little bit about outcomes, but we'll be having a look at that to make sure that it does properly align and prepare providers for the shift in assessment methodology. So that will be early next year. We'll be looking at releasing a refreshed version of that. And then the annual declaration of compliance. We've had quite a few questions around what is it going to be next year. There will be minimal change, but we do hear the feedback that it's not very useful, as in the functionality in the collection system for collecting information in that annual declaration. So we will try to make it things like more than one person should be able to complete it. So the CEO doesn't want to have to fill it all out. Perhaps a compliance officer could do that, and then the CEO makes a declaration. There are too many questions. We'll have a look at how we can manage that. So no substantial change. We won't be changing the requirements. In fact, we'll be trying to look at how we can actually improve the functionality for you in submitting that next year. But the other focus in next year, and probably post-April, once we've moved on a little bit from the assessment methodology, we'll be having a look at how we can co-design with the sector, so the stakeholder liaison group and the provider peaks particularly, a new annual declaration of compliance for 2022 and how that can better support providers in self-assuring. So they're some of the shifts that we'll be looking at making. And next slide, please. So I've probably talked a little bit about this already, but how do we work with you in order to make those shifts? We will work with the sector. So particularly, as I talk about, we work a lot with the stakeholder liaison group who provide a user-centered approach to our design in what we do, are the voice of providers, as are the provider peaks. To make sure that if we do make changes, we need to understand the significance of that change and the impact on providers, small or large or medium, enterprise of all different kinds. We will be providing more self-assurance case studies, and we've heard the call for more case studies. We will be providing those in the new year. Clearfield will be conducting the self-assurance panel sessions. So we've just had a lot going on towards the end of this year. We've pushed those through for next year, and we're hoping that the first panel session will provide you insights into the New Zealand system. So our counterparts in New Zealand have offered to help us out to explain how does self-assurance work in New Zealand and how is it implemented, so you can get some insights about how it works there. We'll also be co-designing the annual declaration on compliance, as I talked about, so working with the SLG stakeholder liaison group and provider peaks. We'll continue to consult, so there's a consultation paper open at the moment on compliance policy and approach to undertakings to remedy, so you have the opportunity to make submissions on that, so that's open until early January. I think it's about the 11th, I'm not 100% sure on the date. And we will obviously be communicating more about assessment, which I mentioned earlier. So we're keen to give you some advice about some subtle changes that will be happening to assessment that might help you to prepare. So that's essentially where we're at in terms of what the consultation has told us and how it has informed our next steps. So I might hand back to Emma so that we can answer the questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Christina and Michelle. So that covers the key components for today's session, but it's definitely not the end of the webinar. Now, for today's session, if you do want to submit a question, remember to keep it broad, relevant to the topic of self-assurance, and to use the question pane in your control panel to do so. As a reminder, the most up-to-date information is on our website, www.asqa.gov.au, and you can also contact our info line on 1300 701 801 or at inquiries@asqa.gov.au. Now, the ASQA website on the homepage includes a direct link to the self-assurance consultation. The The homepage also includes a link to Working Together for Better Regulation. Now, this is a good web page as a really good starting point to understand the overarching concept of the reform program. We also have, and you can access it direct from our homepage, in our latest news section, you can get a copy of the December ASQA update, and that is our monthly update, which goes out to about 33,000 people, so you can definitely subscribe to it if you don't already. That gives you a good monthly update of where we're up to with everything, what we're planning, the things that you can sign up for. Also, the draft ASQA compliance policy and the undertakings to remedy, which Michele just mentioned, that is open until the 11th of January, and we definitely invite you to have a review of that policy and send in your feedback, because your feedback is really important for that. And you can also access the Self-Assurance Consultation Paper feedback from our homepage, so everything is on there. Now, don't forget as well, with that compliance policy, last week we conducted a webinar, and the recording for that is now available on our website. So if you do want to have a look at that before you read through the compliance policy, you can access that direct from our webpage as well. So we'll go to the next slide, which is leading into the questions. And there've been quite a few coming through. Well, I've been able to group some of them together. So Michele, firstly for you, the first one I can actually answer because you have already said this, which is the self-assessment tool being reviewed? I can say with a definitive that is a yes, it is definitely being reviewed. And that is, some people have picked up some things in there that they suggest for some changes on there, so we'll take those on board. Now, the question that's come through is, will providers be required to use the revised or to use the self-assessment tool for the annual declaration on compliance in 2021?
I'm happy to answer that.
Okay, you go first.
Oh, you're right. So it's obviously you won't be required to use it. It's not a requirement of standards at the moment. So I'll let Christina's probably got something to add there.
Yeah, so it's not a requirement, it's a tool. So it's there to support you, and it's one way in which you would assure yourself of the compliance and the areas that you might identify for improvement. So it is linked, obviously, because one activity then leads to that assurance and that statement of compliance, but it's not a mandatory requirement.
And I suppose that leads to the next question of using the self-assessment tool as evidence in an audit activity. Is that something that RTOs should be doing or could be doing?
Yep, so it is obviously one form of evidence, and it also is a form of evidence that might satisfy, at least in part, the activities that the provider is undertaking to continuously improve and assure themselves that they're meeting the standards. So it's obviously an important part of that profile, but it obviously wouldn't be the only thing on which the auditors would rely. They would still be seeking to understand and verify that those standards have been met.
Great. And that leads to a question that's come through about the self-assessment template, using it for internal audits. I'll extend on that to say you definitely can use it for your own internal processes. I believe you can access the tool, again, from our homepage. If you go all the way down to the bottom under forms, you should be able to find it there. So you can definitely use that for your internal purpose as well. The next question for Michele, and I think this relates to something that you discussed on one of your slides, which is, would you be able to talk a bit more about what the challenges are faced by business groups in seeking feedback from their own members and why that issue was contentious?
Yeah, I think it was more around so the business groups talked about, they themselves send out surveys to employers to gain feedback about business issues, and their response rate is not great. So if you have really good connections with industry, and this is probably part of your industry engagement strategy, that if you have some really good industry partners that you're working with, hopefully it shouldn't be too hard to get your feedback. So if you're engaging with them up front as part of your design processes as an input, I suspect you won't have too many challenges getting the outputs at the end of it, or the outcomes at the end of it. But I think if you're operating a less of a sophisticated industry engagement model, you might have trouble getting feedback. And part of the contentious issue was about, will ASQA require you to have the feedback from employers, 15, 20, 30% of your students. So there won't be requirements imposed like that I envisage. It's more about you've made an attempt to get some feedback from employers and industry about, are you delivering the outcomes? Is your curriculum or your materials actually consistent with current industry needs? And remember, it's about needs now and in the future. So are you preparing your students and graduates to operate in the future? Could be in terms of technology, could be in terms of changes in laws that are coming, that sort of thing. So it is about, I think employers are busy and the current environment is going to make it tough. So that's why it was raised as a challenge.
"2020, the year of everybody's really busy." So going into self-assurance and where the self-assurance process is going to lead for ASQA. So we've had a couple of questions about will self-assurance lead to a delegation status or ranking of providers in some way? I'm not sure if that's for Michele or Christina.
I'm happy to start with that. No, we're not anticipating that is the case. I think the way we're seeing self-assurance is that, when we're seeking to understand how providers are performing, and particularly if, for example, there is an area of non-compliance, the nature and the extent of the non-compliance is one part of what we're considering when we determine how we respond to that non-compliance. But equally, we also want to understand the actions of providers themselves to address issues, problems and risks. And that's where the self-assurance piece fits in, because in us determining and differentiating our compliance response, the actions that providers take and our level of confidence that they are committed to continuous improvement and can make sustained improvements when problems arise forms part of our planning of a compliance response. So it's very much embedded in the regulatory response from that perspective. But also we like you, need to form a sector-wide understanding and a sector-wide appreciation of the maturity of the sector in terms of assuring quality and what that profile looks like. And so that's very early days for us. As Michele has said, it's patchy, and we also have varying degrees of maturity in different parts of the sector. So we really need to focus on the work on hand, which is developing that understanding, developing those insights, providing case studies, sharing ways in which this is being done well, to build that capability and to build the culture and systems for providers to be taking early action to mitigate risks and to quality assure their services. And I think, that shift will take us some time. So our focus in the first instance is building that platform, building a really sound understanding of self-assurance and the role that has in improving quality outcomes in vet.
And if we just add on the delegation, I noticed on the website it outlines the criteria. So you need to be updating your scope quite frequently, and you also need to have the systems in place to act as the regulator. So you really, as a delegate, you're undertaking our role in terms of updating your scope and maintaining. You also need to be showing compliance across a registration period. So your compliance is one factor, but there's a range of factors there. So there is a connection perhaps, but there's not a direct connection.
Excellent. We've received a few questions coming through around a similar theme to do with guidance, but also working with the sector in developing guidance. And I'll just give some examples of, is ASQA going to provide guidance on the annual declaration on compliance? Because sometimes interpreting those requirements can be open to interpretation. And then also requests about working more with RTO consultants and also working with providers to build relationships around self-assurance. So do you want to comment a bit on the guidance and the work that we're planning in that space?
Yes, I'll let Michele fill out some of the detail around the guidance, because we have contemplated case studies and a range of materials. But just on the annual statement of compliance as well, one of the things that did emerge was just this sense that perhaps we need some guidance and some key questions for boards and governing bodies when they are themselves undertaking to complete that statement of compliance, because it goes to governance and not what we would prescribe, but how they themselves are satisfying themselves that their organisation that as a provider is meeting those requirements. So there may be a need for some further assistance and some guidance in that regard. So we're exploring that as well.
And just on the case study, so we were keen to get some out, and we've been saying we'll have some for you, but we were really keen to hear what the sector said first. So there are many ways you can go about self-assuring or quality assuring, and you can see variations of this in around the world, in different industries here in Australia. We really needed to understand what our approach to self-assurance was going to be. And now that we've started to shape that up with the sector, we can have a better sense of what case studies will best help the sector prepare for this shift. So we've held back a little bit deliberately so that we're not heading you off down the wrong track, so to speak. Although, if you're self-assuring your operations, it's going to benefit your business regardless. And really, when you focus on business outcomes, it's what you do to make sure that you're delivering on your promise to customers, that you are delivering a quality product. It's all those generic core things that are good education and training, good sound business practice. But we wanted to make sure that we were giving the right guidance and advice rather than just something to fill the void. So it will be coming soon.
And I think we've put a call out, haven't we, through our education and engagement to capture some of the good practices that you may want to share with others. We've just had a round of engagement with states and territories as well, and we've asked them to assist us in identifying where they are seeing through their own contract management and so on, where they are seeing where the providers are self-assuring and doing this well. So, through those activities, we hope to identify a whole range of examples that are scalable, that can be applied to different, provider settings and, smaller providers, making sure that this isn't a one-size-fits-all, because it's really about giving sufficient examples that you can kind of think, oh, that's applicable to my service, and I might be able to adopt some of those practices to improve outcomes.
And that's a definite big thing that I can say on behalf of engagement and education is our main focus. And there is an advantage. We've got the SLG, so that is having 15 RTOs and 2 consultants on hand to help us develop these sorts of case studies and examples. And we really want to be able to do it from the perspective of real life. We don't want to just come up with a scenario that we think will fit. We actually want real experiences. So engagement with SLG is really quite important. But in addition to that, I have engagement with other smaller dedicated industry groups, and we talk to them, and they're being really open and willing and wanting to participate. And also, even earlier this week, we conducted a webinar regarding online learning, and just the sheer number of providers who were commenting in going, I've got some really good examples of how you can do this and how you can check to make sure your students are getting, are actually learning and are really developing. So it's becoming, it's quite lovely actually getting all the providers coming in with really good suggestions, and that's where we want to head. So we've got real examples as opposed to stock standard, and that leads to a number of questions that have come through regarding different examples for self-assurance for different industries and also different size providers. I know from an education and guidance perspective, we really want to focus so that it might not be your exact industry, but it's something that you can relate to be able to put into practice. Which leads to the question about industry. Will there be different requirements around self-assurance depending on the industry? For example, if it is a less risky industry such as business as opposed to another one which is probably more complex?
No, I think that actually goes to the provider themselves to understand how they can assure themselves that they're meeting the standards. So the standards requirements are there for the sector. The extent to which you may need to satisfy yourselves or oversight the risk that is there depends, in fact, on your own enterprise and the nature of training that you're providing. So, you know, you would naturally expect that there are higher levels of assurance around higher risk areas. But what ASQA will be interested in is how you have satisfied yourself that those mechanisms are working and that you have oversighted those risks in a way that is proportionate to the level of risk.
My mouse is just moving around. And then this one is actually for, I'm going to say Michele. You've mentioned self-assurance, particularly in New Zealand. Should, and this is a question from an RTO, should we model our self-assurance around the New Zealand version? Is this the model that ASQA is heading towards?
I think there's things we can learn from New Zealand. So they're 10 years into their implementation, so they're quite mature in what they've done. It's funny, when we spoke to New Zealand beginning of this year, Emma and I headed across the Tasman to talk to them, and they talk about how they ended up in self-assurance, and it was out of a fee abuse kind of scenario. So they have sort of ended up in the same place, a bit off the track. But so Joyce made recommendations, and the rapid review has learned from those recommendations. But their architecture and their system is slightly different. So, as an example, New Zealand do accredit courses. Now, I know we accredit courses, but we are not the primary accreditation function for the sector. They're much smaller. There's, you know, they don't have the federation. There's a whole range of differences that exist. So the context for New Zealand is slightly different to what it is in Australia. As I said, there are things that we learn from them. They talk about the value that self-assurance can bring. They talk about the value that providers can deliver for their students. And I think that those things are the key things to our long-term vision, which is all about, are you giving your students a better life out of your training? So these are really long-term outcomes, and I think there's things we can learn from them. They also talk about an evaluative approach, which is, I think there's things that are similar to what we might do, but we need to work with the sector to work out whether those things are really fit for purpose for Australia. So what I would say is there are learnings we can take from New Zealand and other sectors, but we really need to find a fit for purpose approach for the sector based on the advice that the sector gives us.
Excellent. A question that has come through, and Michele, if you are comfortable for me to respond, it's a bit more of a technical question. Which is, can our industry engagement strategy be part of the training and assessment strategy? So just to comment for that more from a regulatory operations perspective, your training and assessment strategy does not have to be one document. It's your strategy of how you're delivering, and how you're delivering should be backed by industry confirming that it is appropriate for that market. So absolutely, your industry engagement strategy should be part of your training and assessment strategy. How you design it, how you structure it, how you link it all together, that's how your business operates. So absolutely, it definitely can. Some other questions, and I'm noting the time, but planning a question for two more left. One of them linking together regarding external consultants. First question that came through, do we have to use a consultant? And then I'll feed straight into the second question, such as, is there plans for ASQA to provide external consultancy as a service for RTOs, or listing, providing a list of quality consultants that RTOs can use?
I might answer that. No, we don't have any immediate plans to develop any panels or recommend consultancies. And in fact, there are some perils for the regulator in taking that path, including sort of conflicts and difficulties in then being able to oversight and regulate outcomes if we've been involved in advisory capacity. So some of those things, of course, are matters for providers to consider, whether or not they need to harness any external expertise in aspects of their business as they would in any aspect of a business in terms of compliance and performance. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all there, and there definitely is no requirement to, go to external consultancy. In fact, the more the business enterprise itself understands its own operations and how it's assuring quality, and that is embedded as part of the culture and systems within the organisation, the better. Of course, there's always opportunities from time to time for external review and input, and that is for each business enterprise to kind of grapple with in terms of what's needed to support a good outcome.
Thank you very much. And the last question, Michele, this might be for you, but definitely Christina can also respond. What is the difference between self-assurance and quality assurance?
So I think they're very similar. What I will say though, why we haven't picked up ISO is we know that providers often who implement it are still not compliant. And the key message, and it might have actually come from Christina, her wise words, is that the standards are actually the expectations that students, industry and the community have of you as providers. So, and that's another difference with New Zealand, they actually endorse their own standards. So those standards are fit for purpose, they're specific and they're unique to our sector. They have been designed by governments, by the community, and they communicate the specific expectations of you as a provider that ASQA is given to work with. So that's where I see the key difference and why we haven't picked up a generic quality assurance ISO approach.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. Now, just a few more questions that have come through, which I can easily answer around referencing some webinars, some sessions, some other things that we have previously conducted, and also links to the self-assurance template. I'll engage with our communications team offline. So when you get a copy of the recording for this, I'll make sure that we've got some links in there for you as well, so it's really easy for you to find. And some other questions that have come through relating to providing examples, particularly around real life scenarios and also around governance. And that's something that we're definitely working on, which is where we do want to get your involvement in providing some really good examples. So they are definitely on the list. So we will go to the final slide, noting that I've only got 2 minutes left. And I would like to thank everybody for attending today's webinar. In particular, I'd like to thank both Christina and Michele for being involved and all the team who work behind the scenes to make this come together nice and smoothly. If you do have any questions, you can contact our info line, and the contact details are on the slide and also our website. Now, as I did just say, a link to the recording of the session will be emailed to you within the next few days, and I'll make sure those extra links are on there as well so that you can find everything. There will be a post-webinar feedback after this, so once you do shut it down, if you do have any suggestions for future topics, please include those in your feedback after the webinar closes. And just a final, as I said, this is the last one for 2020. I want to thank you so much for the year. We haven't, previous years, we haven't done a lot of webinars, so this is really obviously because of COVID starting in, but it's also been a great opportunity to see how well we can engage through webinars and the real value of it, particularly making sure that everybody can be able to attend without having to spend an entire day coming in to see us for our other types of presentations. Hopefully next year we'll be able to do a lot of things. Hopefully we will start to be able to see everybody face to face again. That will be absolutely fantastic. But in the meantime, I would like to wish you all a very Merry Christmas, a very Happy New Year. I hope you have a fantastic holiday for taking time off, and we will see you all in 2021. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Emma.